I would like to welcome you to our 9th IAS Weekly Thursday seminar. And we are very proud and esteemed to have Dr. Anyidoho, Senior Research Fellow at ISA, and also our very own, the one, the only, Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofo. And chairing today, we are also esteemed to have our Professor Joji Chikata, also an associate professor at ISA, whose research areas include gender and development issues, gender equity policies and practices, land tenure systems and agrarian livelihoods, the politics of land tenure reforms, informal labor relations and work conditions, and also gender issues in higher education. We expect this to be a very exciting and provocative seminar. So with no further ado, I will pass it over to our chair, Professor Joji Chikata.
Thank you very much, Oba. Welcome to this seminar, which, as you can see, is titled, How Can I Come to Work on Saturdays When I Have a Family? Ghanaian Women and Bank Working in the Neoliberal Era. I think Oba was right when he said that this seminar is really going to be interesting. And I'm especially pleased to be here because I was a member of the larger group that conducted a study of which this presentation is a part. 4 of us and 3 of us are here. Akosua will be coming, she promised. Decided to look at the changing character of women's work in Ghana in the neoliberal era. I'm sure all of you here are here because of work, so we know the kind of role work plays in our lives, not just as a source of income, but around questions of identity as well, and basically a very large part of who we are on a day-to-day basis. And we have noticed in the literature that there was a lot of discussion about informalization of work, and we wanted to explore what this meant in the lives of Ghanaian women. We had also observed the changing character of women's work in Ghana. So we thought that to do this, we could look at 2 extremes of work in Ghana. So we chose bank work and also domestic work, because we thought that there were 2 extremes of women's work in Ghana. We thought that if we could understand what was changing in relation to these 2 extremes, we might be able to have an interesting take on what's happening to women's work in Ghana. So today I'm really pleased that we can hear about the segments which concern bank work. And so I'd like to call on my colleagues to make their presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. Professor Chikata did not add that she was the principal investigator for the study. And that's a good thing. And that's not the reason why she's chairing, but that's a very good thing. So if there are any difficult questions for Nanekwe and myself, we shall field them to her. So the title of our study, as we've been told, is How Can I Come to Work on Saturday When I Have a Family? Ghanaian Women in Bank Work in a Neoliberal Era. When I joined the University of Ghana in 1989, there were 3 banks associated with the campus with live streaming. This morning I spent 2 minutes deciding the color of the beads that I should wear and how they would reflect on camera. But anyway, back to the scenario. When I joined Legon, there were 3 banks that were associated with this campus, and they closed, I believe, at 3 o'clock. There was no Saturday banking. So if you had to do business with a bank, you needed to navigate within 8 and sometimes 9 o'clock and 2 or 3. A lot has changed since then, and that's part of what we're talking about today. So the rationale for the study, the chair has told us a little bit about that already. On the screen you see what we are going to present to you today. We'll say a bit more about the rationale for this study. We'll give you a brief overview of the Ghana context, make some comments on the informal sector as well as the banking sector, the financial sector, and the banking sector. Within that, we'll say something about our methodology, not go into too much detail, and then really what you want to hear, and Akua will be doing that, sharing what we found and what we would like to convey to you, our own thoughts. So why were we interested in bank workers within the larger context of women's work in the country? There have been very few studies on women's work within the formal sector. If you look at literature on women's work in Ghana and in the sub-region, and I dare say across the continent, a lot of the work focuses on women in the informal sector. Women in the informal sector in West Africa have been both demonized and romanticized, and they've also been hailed in terms of how hard they work and so forth. But if you look at the formal sector, the work is primarily limited to women CEOs, women in administration, women at the higher levels of representation. There is very little that allows us to understand what's happening to women within the middle tier. And the banks provide us with a unique opportunity to look at that, because it's also an area that is seen as very privileged. You see young women go to work, they are dressed in their suits, and it looks like a very comfortable place to work. And this is one of the reasons that we are interested in looking at bank workers within the formal sector. Of course, over the years, in the last 15 to 20 years, there have been significant changes in the financial sector as well that have implications not just for those of us who are clients, but also for those who work in the banks. And of course, when you get to the bank on a Saturday, and this is something that we have come to as being our right within, as clients of financial services, if they happen to have shut the door maybe 5 minutes before they were supposed to, you get irritated, but forgetting that there are people who actually need to do other things on a Saturday. So bank work has been romanticized, and we want to not necessarily show that it's not a romantic place, but give the truer picture, if you like, of what's going on in the banking sector. So the last 100 years, the economy in our country has changed, not that significantly, but in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been swift change in the service sector. The agricultural sector remains predominant. The extractive industries remain predominant in terms of outputs and contribution to our gross domestic product. But there have been changes that are less obvious. And those of us in the urban areas will be the ones who primarily appreciate those changes that have been going on. Now, in spite of the fact that agriculture remains an important contributor to our economy, its share has declined and continues to decline. And I'm sure that we know that. People also have moved, the rural-urban migration rates are increasing. People are moving from rural areas. Young people are not as interested in agriculture as they used to be. And even the extractive industries recently are facing some downturns. So agricultural contribution, you see that on the slide, to gross domestic product in 2010 was 30%. The service sector contribution to GDP in 2010, this is the time that we started the study, was 51%. And within the financial sector, the telecoms have become very significant players and continue to be significant players. If we look at formal work and kind of throw our minds back to the informal sector, we realize that women do continue to predominate in the informal sector, whether it's trading, whether it's domestic work, which was the other slice of our project, whether it's providing services, ad hoc and temporary services in a variety of areas. Women do predominate in the informal sector. And generally, that's a sector that is more precarious than the formal sector. Obviously, it's less obvious. It is very unlikely to be regulated, and the incomes are lower because we're not policing that sector or regulating it. There's a large body of work on women in the informal sector, and particularly trading, as I mentioned, and much less work on the formal sector. Now, the formal sector is assumed, if we look at formal and informal as a dichotomy, which one of the aspects of this study is to show that the lines are actually quite blurred. There's much less work on the formal sector that allows us to see the character or the landscape of what's going on in that sector. So we assume it to be a safe and secure environment. Okay? You're not necessarily plying the streets, you're not at risk of the elements and so forth. But we can think of security in a variety of ways, and we'll see that actually there are other things going on. We assume formal sector work also to be decent work. So whenever the concept of indecent work is thrown out in the discourse, we do not think of the formal sector. And so, possibly as a result of this, but also related to this, there has been little critical analysis of labor relations within the formal sector. And little attention has been paid to the increasing informalization, which is what we are saying in this study, informalization of work within the formal sector. So for example, the use of agency workers within the formal sector has a flavor, if you like, or a character of informalization. So just to say a bit about financial reforms that have gone on across much of the continent and of course now going on around the world. The financial sector required, and we're talking here about structural adjustment in the 1980s, but of course structural adjustment has not ended. But the structural adjustment reforms that came about in the 1980s, or that were imposed upon us in the 1980s, one of the requirements or one of the outcomes was that interest rates were liberalized from the central bank and then of course to the commercial banks. And banks were allowed to invest and lend where they calculated that they would extract the most profits. So they were allowed to do that. And capital requirements were set to weed out inefficient banks, including state-owned banks. So if you didn't have a certain amount of capital, you were not allowed to continue to operate as a bank. And some banks folded up and there were mergers and so forth. And government sectoral preferences were removed. So the government did not continue to have the monopoly in deciding how its own banks, but also how the banking sector would relate with its clientele. So we have regulatory bodies. As a result of that, and the liberalizing of the financial sector, there was a huge influx of private banks into the sector. Most of these banks were foreign banks, and most of these foreign banks tended to come from Nigeria and South Africa. So there's been a huge influx of these banks. So you see that in 1990, there were no private banks. We had a couple, Stanchart and Barclays Bank, I believe, if I'm not messing up with the data here. But by 2008, there were 25. Okay, so that's a huge growth over a short period of time. And this also is related to the fact that now there's huge competition in the banking sector. So the banks have to be very aggressive in order to get us as clients to join their banks. They have we all know this, there are innovative ways to attract new customers. At the beginning of the academic year, we see all kinds of performances on campus from the different banks to attract students as customers. Customers, as a result, have also become more demanding. I'm sure there are many people in this room who have hopped from one bank to another because of their increasing levels of dissatisfaction. The EcoBank on this campus has now got an executive lounge for senior members so that you don't have to stand in the queue enjoying the students, the plebeians, and you can have your class. They can serve you coffee, and it's very quiet. So these are all examples of ways in which the banks have responded to this increasing demand of their clientele and their prospective clients. There's a greater use of automation and technology, so you're very unlikely to be a bank customer today who is not doing some transaction or the other online. ATMs came into the fray as well. So all of this was to meet the requirements of the more demanding clients. Saturday banking came along. Sooner or later, I'm sure we'll have Sunday banking. Employment agencies entered the picture because banks, as we know, most private entities have to make profits and seem to need to make huge profits. They've got shareholders who are also extremely demanding. They can now farm out a large sector of their work to employment agencies and keep just the bare minimum, in some cases, of permanent workers for whom they then have to pay social security and other benefits. So you can use agency workers, they can do some of your tasks for you, and you pay the agency and you are left with a lower wage bill. So a few words on the methodology and then I will be handing over to Manipia. So the largest study on bank workers and domestic workers took place in Accra, Kumasi and Tamale. And the rationale for this was to try and get different parts of the country, the economic, environmental, ecology to be somewhat diverse. We also wanted kind of, a more urban and a less urban environment, but we did need to make sure that the banks that we were interested in were presented. So we then undertook a mapping study of 13 of 25 banks that were operating in 2009, which is when we began the field work. And we took information on staff locations, their numbers, their statuses. So we have a database for these 13 banks telling us the kinds of workers they have, how many they are, how many are male, how many are female, senior management and lower staff, how many are agency workers, and so forth. We then did a survey of 301 bank workers in 6 banks, and the sample was purposefully carried out. And then subsequently did life history interviews with 11 bank workers, including permanent staff as well as agency workers, and in-depth interviews with HR managers and union leaders. And some demographics from the data that might be of interest to you. Our sample included 62% females and 38% males. We did oversample for females, I should say. Respondents, 71% had a tertiary education, 15% had a secondary education. In terms of their family status, 52% were married, 72% had one or more dependents, 28% had none. This aspect of dependence was particularly important to us because we were very interested in looking at how people married bank work in the formal sector with, particularly for women, their reproductive roles that are very blurred between home and workplace. Hence the picture you saw on the first slide. Sometimes you might not physically be carrying your child to work, but conceptually you're carrying her to work, and she in your mind she's sitting there next to you, and you're trying to multitask. In terms of level within the bank, 15% were at management level, 19% were supervisors, 66% junior staff. In terms of status, 66% were permanent workers, 25% agency workers, and 9% were other, because there were some non-permanent staff who were working within the banks, but not necessarily through an agency. And at this point, I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Anyidoho. Thank you.
These are the changes that we observed through our analysis of our data, and this is what we'll be talking about. Describing what these changes are, and more importantly, what these have meant for workers, whether in the banking halls themselves or behind the scenes somewhere. As we've mentioned, as the banking sector has expanded and there's been more competition, it's not only for customers, but also for people who are going to be working for these customers, for these this increased number of banks. So there have been increased employment opportunities, but as we'll see, these opportunities are not evenly distributed. Not everybody has equal access, if you like, to the jobs that have become available. So this slide we created from the data provided by the 13 banks in our mapping exercise. And you'll see that most of the jobs are in Greater Accra. Let's be even more specific. We know that these jobs are actually in Accra and maybe some of them in Tema. Because this is where all the banks have their headquarters, and this is where you have the most branches. Almost half of the branches would be in Accra, or perhaps Tema also. And 62% of the labor force, according to the information provided us. So if you are in Accra or have the opportunity to move here, then you're more likely to take advantage of the expansion in job opportunities. Overall, there were more males than there were females in Accra, about 59% to 41%, which also may have something to do with transfer policies and family reasons, as we'll discuss a bit more. The fact that there are actually more women in the Accra branches than there are elsewhere. Also important is the location of women in the banking hierarchy. Women make up about 9.6% of senior management, you'll see from this table. Put another way, only 0.3% of all female employees were at the highest echelons of the banks compared to 2.1% of male employees. Now these numbers don't represent what's happening in the entire industry. As we said, we got 13 banks. We had a hard time getting them to give us the information. There were concerns about security and confidentiality and competition. But it's highly indicative of what is happening in the industry as a whole. And one thing that we can't get is that we have race segmentation, which we see in other types of formal work and also informal work in Ghana and other parts of the world. The fact that women largely populate the lower levels of the hierarchy, in this case in banking. So they are mostly in areas like clerical and secretarial work, in contrast to males who are better represented in the higher levels. And where are these workers coming from? In our survey, the majority, about 60%, had worked for less than 4 years in their current job in the bank. So these were fairly new employees, suggesting to us that there is opening for people to come into the banks. Of this group, roughly a third were working for the first time in a bank. So again, the banks are absorbing new employees. However, more than a quarter of all respondents had worked in at least one other bank. So it shows also that there is recycling of bank workers in the sector. But not every worker has equal opportunity to move. According to the HR managers, mid-level officers are the most sought after. So these are managers, usually specialists like corporate managers, risk managers. They are often poached from the older and bigger banks to take up more senior positions in the newer banks. So for the worker, this provides the prospect of a quicker advancement on a less crowded ladder in a newer, smaller bank. But since, as we've shown, men are more likely to be in these managerial positions, they are the ones who are more likely to be poached, more likely to have the opportunity to be promoted and to make more money in a new position. And then finally, we noticed that the opportunities are much less bright for you if you're hired through an agency. You'll see from this table, again, that agency workers are congregated at the bottom. And you'll see, if you look on the extreme right of the table, the zeros up there say that if you're an agency worker, you're much, much less likely to be in supervisory or middle management and going upwards. So opportunities, yes, but definitely not for everybody. Then we looked at conditions of service which have generally improved as a result of competition. You know, banks need to keep up if they want to retain their workers. They need to keep up with the lures being put out by the newer banks who desperately need workers. And we tried. I know this is very, very tiny. Forgive me. I could not figure out technologically how to make that bigger and still stay on the slide. But I'll tell you, what we've highlighted in blue are improvements. So basically you have numbers of banks that are offering different types of benefits. And we try to show whether what they offered in the past versus what they were offering at the time that we did the survey. And we tried to also break it down by agency workers, management, and non-management permanent staff. So what we had is that more banks offer personal loans, medical, health, and dental care than they did in the past. But there's been a reduction in those who are offering housing and clothing allowances. Okay. Now the survey that we did revealed that about 90% of workers were entitled to the very, very popular personal loans. But significantly, this did not include agency workers. As an aside, we noted that the few banks that provided some benefits for agencies were international banks. So these were banks that had their headquarters outside of Ghana, and we wondered, but we didn't ask at the time, whether they did this because of their own requirements back at home or why. But generally, even within these banks, agency workers have significantly worse conditions of service. Now, maternity leave, very important, especially for female workers. Well, this appears to be standardized across the industry as required by the law, and so we had, I think in this case, 11 of the 13 banks provided us this information. So all of them said that they provided maternity leave to management and non-management, but only one of the banks provided it for agency workers. Paternity leave, only one bank provided this to permanent workers, and nobody provided this to agency workers. So it seems pretty standard. The Ghanaian law entitles women to 12 weeks maternity leave, so that was usually done. But also, a new mother is entitled to half-day work for 6 months after she returns to work, which is officially on the books, yet as one senior operations officer told us, she said the half-day is not very true. It's the right thing on paper, but not in reality, because there's so much work to do that people cannot leave on time. So that's the reality of trying to get what you're entitled to legally. But beyond maternity leave, it's very hard to get unpaid leave from any of the banks. Only 5 banks offer this, and more likely to workers, non-managerial workers, than to managers who I guess they cannot afford to let go. None of the banks that provided data on benefits offered childcare facilities or any kind of allowances to workers with children. So all these have implications, of course, for work-home balance for women who, by social custom, are expected to bear the greater responsibility for care work. And the fact that managers have a harder time getting these kinds of leaves also has implications for women's willingness and ability to advance up the corporate ladder. We want to talk also about work culture, because if the culture has changed for customers, you get a few more smiles these days than you did in the past, a better sense that you are wanted and needed than in the past. Sadly, the work atmosphere has also changed for workers, but perhaps not in as pleasant ways as it might be for customers. One of the phrases that we kept on hearing from the banks was this idea that work is now more performance driven, so you have to generally work harder. As somebody said, it's about competition. People are compelled to work better, more efficiently, smarter than before. If you don't do that as individuals and as an organization, you'll be left out of the competition. And one of the ways that you have to work harder, work smarter, is you have to meet certain targets. So another quote, marketing is key. These are from HR managers. Targets are tight. I naturally wouldn't have been good at marketing, but now you are made a branch manager, you have to go and look for accounts. You have to go to people you don't know, you have to go and sell your products. And workers talked about how difficult it was to meet these targets and how much pressure, how much stress there was on them. You also had to have a broader set of knowledge and skills. The suites of services you're expected to sell is expanding. You must know a lot about your product, so you just have to be more knowledgeable. And then, of course, what we like, what works for us, is the focus on customer service, relationship banking, and so on. Banking traditionally was armchair banking, but now everybody is out. We also had a bank, one of the oldest banks, I'm not going to tell you which one, that talked about how they really had to work with their workers to get them to be more friendly, and eventually decided that maybe what they needed to do was just phase out all the old people because they just weren't getting it, and get newer people in who were more willing to smile and just be, generally friendlier. So this is a really big part of the culture now. And as a result of this having to work harder, meet targets, etc., the organization of work has changed. As Akosua said, we now have people working, the banks opening for longer hours. But beyond the official opening hours, people are compelled to work even longer hours. So if you look at the pie chart over there, I hope that that's a bit clearer now. 80% of workers that we interviewed said they work between 10 to 12 hours a day. That's almost half the day, which is pretty significant. And 12% said they work 13 hours and over. That's, I can't quite imagine that. And then, of course, there's weekend hours. 67% work some or all weekends throughout the year. So, apart from the official hours, as I said, from 8 to 4, and I'm sure they also have their official hours for closing, maybe 5 or 6, some people work even longer than they ought to, and without overtime. My worker said sometimes I get overtime, especially for Saturdays, but on normal days, overtime's supposed to start from 5:30. I don't always get paid because when I'm done, I just go. And she just goes because she does not want to appear to be not hardworking by asking for overtime payments, because that signals that maybe you're not as serious as you ought to be. So obviously all of this has implication for work-life balance. A union leader said, we realized that it was an industry wave that we needed to deal with, this having to work more hours, having to do, have a higher load. If one bank decided it was not going to happen, you were somehow disadvantaged as a bank, because that would affect the bank's bottom line and ultimately the workers' salaries, is what he was saying. However, the same union leader expressed concern about the lack of recognition of social arrangements, and this is the second quote. He said, apart from a worker, you are a mother, you are a father, etc., and you have social arrangements like funerals and family meetings and so on, and the bank work just did not seem to acknowledge that. Another union leader complained that the management of his bank only thought in terms of financial cost-benefit analysis and did not consider the social aspect in decisions that they were making about, how work is organized and so on. And this wasn't just union leaders. You have an HR manager's quote there about the social challenge and the pressure on bank workers. Another bank worker put it bluntly. She said, bank work is not too good for a married person because the person leaves early for work and comes back late. All your time is taken, even weekends, and it can get stressful. All your days are almost taken from you. So, because we acknowledge that women have more of a burden on them in terms of their home responsibilities. We were particularly interested in whether there was recognition of these gender differences, especially in terms of the greater burden on women. So we would ask the HR managers, and a few of them would say, no, we are gender neutral, like that was a good thing. So we asked them specifically, are there any kinds of policies, formal or informal, that acknowledge this reality? As I mentioned, maternity leave was standard across the bank, so they would mention that. The flexi hours was sometimes official, sometimes, if your supervisor felt like it. Another way that they did acknowledge the social reality was in terms of transfers, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the things that they did do for women is that they did not tend to transfer women outside of the main urban centers, and especially Accra, because, as one manager said, a woman might follow a man to his new job, but they don't expect men to be following women around. So they tended to be considerate of married women, not all women. So this is how come you have such a great number. One of the reasons why you have such a great number of women in Accra, for instance. But that was really about it. And one HR manager who was, for the most part, very cosmopolitan and socially aware and so on, still talked about how men were just more user-friendly, because he gave an anecdote of a meeting that he had where this woman was running late because she had to take care of her kid, and he wasn't necessarily being unsympathetic, but that was the reality. As a manager, he just found it hard to have to deal with that. So how did women respond? They had to decide between their career and family responsibilities, especially childbirth. They had to decide whether or not they were going to make a fuss about not getting their flexi hours like they ought to. They also showed preferences for certain positions in the bank, like operations, which was generally considered a little easier to mesh with your home responsibilities. They resisted transfers, for instance, or attempts to move them into positions within the bank, or to geographical locations that they felt was not incompatible with what they had to be doing outside of work. And others also then had people who would take care of their domestic responsibilities for them, some of them, obviously not all of them. So you had, we found that women in management positions tended to have domestic help more often than people in lower positions, which might reflect having more money, but also just the fact that they really had their hands full. So we want to talk about what all of this means then for women and formal work, because bank work represents formal work. So we showed that changes in the banking sector have led to some positive outcomes, such as increased opportunities for employment and training and advancement, and for better conditions of service within the sector. At the same time, we point out that men, permanent workers, are better placed to benefit from these opportunities for entry and advancement in the industry. So in this way, our study echoes the ILO 2010 report, which states that across the world, the circumstances of female employment, the sectors where women work, the types of work they do, the relationship of women to their jobs, the wages they receive, bring fewer gains monetarily, socially, and structurally to women than are brought to typical working men. And this is what we've seen in that these changes, particularly because of women's greater responsibility, because of gender rules and norms, which require them to do this second shift, to use a popular phrase, that women receive less benefits and actually in some cases have more of a greater burden as a result of these changes across the sector. And so we want our paper and our findings to speak to the changes, the implications of changes in formal work within a wider social context that is less pervious to change in gendered expectations. So in some ways, the opening of spaces that should be economically empowering for women can become restrictive as societal and workplace gender norms converge. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
So, here we are. I think our colleagues have left us a lot of things to think about, and perhaps we'll never look at banking work the way we see it, only as consumers of banking services, but begin to reflect a bit more on what it means for those who work in the banks, particularly the young women that look so sharp all the time, and we don't actually know how they do it. So I'd like to open the floor for comments, questions, contributions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I could really relate to a number of things you shared because of the personal experience I have with some of these issues. I was wondering if you interrogated whatever differences there might be in terms of salary allowances and other benefits for males and females, because I know that although many of these institutions might have very good HR policies on work benefits, a lot of things are also discretionary, and it depends, things are done for people individually, and even for males or females, you may find people doing the same work, but then they have very different benefits and remuneration. And I can imagine that it will be more so for, the difference between males and females and what benefits are accrued to them for the job they do. My other issue also relates, to the work women do with these organizations and how it relates to their reproductive roles. You did touch on some, but I'm sure in the life stories, you got some more details on what women themselves feel about the rigid nature of the work. They do earn some good income, which is okay, but also because we know that practically the gender roles are still what they have been, to a very large extent, and women are predominantly doing a lot of the work in the household. How do they feel about having to work on Saturdays and even Sundays? Because I know that in some cases, unofficially, they don't have to work on Sunday, but you have so much work to do that you can't afford to. And on Monday morning, you have to deliver the reports. And so if you have to come in on a Sunday to work, you will. And how do they manage with looking after their children, cooking, and doing all the other things they have to do, and as well as deliver their work? My final issue actually relates to the labor turnover. Did you try to investigate, the rate at which men and women are leaving these jobs and how, different it is for men and women? And I know that many women do leave. There is recycling, you touched on that, but some also just leave the industry altogether. And recently, two friends told me, I've left, I'm at home. And aren't you going to get another job? No, I want to look after my children. And one said, it was so sad. Her children are in JHS, and this is a bank worker, and one could not read very well. I couldn't just imagine that this would happen. And this is a senior manager in the bank. So what it means, and she's been working right after school, she went into a bank and she's been working in the bank for over 15 years now. They just don't have the time. I know, I've been in this before, I know it's very difficult. So how do they, and some leave, people just leave and just abandon the whole industry. How do they leave? A final one.
I know it's very interesting.
Thank you. Edward Nandigne. You may have mentioned it, I didn't hear. If so, ignore the question. I was wondering if you sampled any female HR managers, and if so, was there any difference between their attitude towards female workers and the attitude of male HR managers to female workers?
My question has to do with, so you talk a lot about gender differences, so the differences between men and women. I'm just wondering about categories within women. So you speak a lot about married women, but there are differences within women and how they would cope with work-life balance. So married women with children, married women without children, and even single women. And in relation to that, you spoke about how married women cope with the work-life balance by choosing by choosing jobs within operations, for example. So speaking about single women as well, do they make the preemptive decision considering gender roles and the expectations around when women are supposed to get married, when women are supposed to have children? Do they make preemptive decisions to work in, say, HR or operations or certain positions that are less higher?
We made mention of women resistant transfers and in relation to the compatibility of their work to informal sector in reference to banking. I would want you to probably throw more light on that particular element, and also if there are any statistics of women resistant transfers in the state, in the various bank government. Thank you.
Yes, it's a kind of puzzle. One of my judges introduced a girl to me. The girl he wants to marry. This girl works in a bank. And considering the fact that women are agents of socialization, the fact that this man works in a bank where they work throughout the week, come home late, and even are expected to go to work on either Saturdays or Sundays. What advice should I give to my son? Should I ask him not to marry a woman who's
Well, you know your son better. You know your son better.
There is a general perception that people who work in a bank earn a lot of money. And to some extent, it is true. Yes. The question I want to ask is that if women earn a lot, or if women are expected to be earning a lot from the bank, yet they are complaining about the social issues, the fact that they do not have time to take care of their families. It is also a fact that people who have money, when they happen to find themselves in a certain social environment, they are the people who are recognized in our society. So what is the position of women then? Are they saying that they prefer to go home, and when they do not even have, if they haven't accumulated enough that can take care of them, and especially if their husbands or any other supporters cannot help them to take care of their children, will they prefer to go, leave their job, and probably go to take care of their families? Or what is the relationship between not having time to take care of their families and then their social standing in society? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this really thought-provoking session. You have a lot on your plate. So.
Excuse me, we're not taking them in any particular order. That's the issues we'll table. We'll respond to them. And Akua will pick up on what, hopefully what I have missed. Let me start from the first speaker, and I hope that my response ties in with some of the other questions. The notion of helping. Those of us who are in the gender class that Deborah and I teach, we've talked about the notion of helping. And the notion of helping comes from the idea that reproductive work is women's work, and the minute that a man baths a child, feeds a child, cooks meals, he is helping the woman. So in yesterday's class, we actually even talked about the notion of mothering versus parenting. Both man and woman are parents, but it seems that we invest a lot in mothering, and if fathers parent, then they are helping mothers to parent their own children. So, and maybe this speaks to also the issue about advice that should be given to a son. think that that son should be heavily invested in parenting, so he should be independent enough to be able to not be afraid of birthing a child. If his wife is not home, or even if she's home, he may also... Men should parent and run households, not just because women are absent or unavailable. This is where we need to go as we look at the way the informal sector, the formal sector is pressurizing work, particularly in urban areas. And that is what I will say about the issue of the notion of helping. But it is a fact, of course, that reproductive work is women's work, and the real question is, how do women cope? So one of the ways that they cope has a lot to do with what our colleagues in this project did. They rely on domestic workers, heavily on domestic workers. Maybe our colleagues are both here. They may want to say something about domestic workers. Domestic workers invariably are also going to be female. Those domestic workers also have families, and sometimes the domestic workers also have domestic workers looking after their children. So it becomes a cycle and recycling of female reproductive work, and we really need to think about that and the roles that men play in families. So they have domestic workers, they wake up early. They also have mothers and sisters, so again, other women picking up the slack. I remember in the interviews that we did in Kumasi, we were waiting for an agency worker to interview. This was an agency worker. She wasn't earning a lot. She was a temporary worker. She should have closed at 5 o'clock. We had spoken to her on phone, we were waiting for her. 6 o'clock she was still there, 6:30 she was still there. 7 o'clock was when she finally closed. She wasn't going to get any overtime for this. We eventually gave her a ride home and interviewed her at home. And I think she was, if I remember correctly, she was a single parent whose mother was taking care of the children. She was holding on to these long hours because, as Nanepia said, she wants to convey that she's hardworking, and when the bank looks round, who might we pick as the next permanent worker, she will be the first one who comes to mind. So this is trying to cope in a way with these other people who are assisting, but also hoping that when she becomes a permanent worker, she will have a little bit more leeway and a bit more income to navigate within the system. So there are a lot of examples like that. There are women, obviously, who are going to work very early and closing late, again, to create this, to convey this notion of being ideal workers. There was an interesting quote from, and maybe it was from an interview that you did, because I don't have it in my memory, but I just saw it in the notes, that in one of the banks, they have morning devotion. And morning devotion, Ghanaians are very religious, so there's morning devotion in the bank. And it becomes the site where people who have worked well are praised, and issues that are not as wonderful are also put onto the table. So it becomes an informal, supposedly safe space, but where messages about the kind of worker that we want are conveyed. And so the culture in the bank becomes one of reinforcing this ideal worker that Anyidoho mentioned, who is hardworking, who is available, who will kill themselves for the bank. And so, again, women are looking for the softer areas, operations that you're more likely to be able to close on time and to go home. Again, maybe this speaks to Deborah's question a bit about how people are people leaving the banks. I don't think that we had a lot of information on that, but we did find that people who had left the older banks going to the newer banks because there was more opportunity for promotion and higher salaries and more benefits. Some of them are going back to the older banks and saying, you know what, we are more interested in the social side of our lives than the benefits and the money. We've got a life to live, and we're getting out of this rat race and going where, the bank is a little less demanding. That must have been an interview that you carried out. Resisting transfer, I'm not sure that we have any information on that. I'll let you talk about HR managers because you were the one who interviewed them. In terms of remuneration and the subjectivity of it, I don't know how much we can speak to that. But one thing that we did find was in terms of selecting people to go for training, because training is not just about, you know, improving your career, but it's an opportunity to get out of your usual space, and it's an opportunity to get some money, because you're given money to go for the training. There's a per diem and all of that. And obviously, you reward people who you perceive to be more hardworking and who are more beneficial. I'm not sure that we can conclude that men were selected more than women were, but certainly the managers are picking the people that they think, you know, it's almost a little bit of a reward. So those who are the more hardworking get selected to go for the training.
Priscilla's question, we didn't just talk about married women. I think the only time I said married women was when I was referring to transfers. When I said women have family responsibilities, I meant generally both married and single. And if you, one of our slides showed that 52% of our sample was married, 72% had dependents. So clearly this is not just people with husbands, but single women also. So whenever I talked about family responsibilities or home, maybe I should have just said home responsibilities, I'm referring to both married and single women. They seem to have similar issues. Okay.
But having said that, it seems to be that it might be interesting to think about what it might mean if you are single in the bank and if you are married. It may be something that perhaps we didn't look at that closely, because the statistics suggest that they are coping in similar ways. But I think it's an interesting question about what differences among women within the institution might mean. So for example, she talked about older women, this idea that the banks preferred younger women, and they were hoping to get rid of all these old people who will not learn the new culture. I think it says something about what might be a difference among women. There's also this idea that banks actually prefer women for certain kinds of jobs, and there's a profile of the kinds of women that they prefer. And I think that that's also an interesting difference amongst women and so on. And I suspect if we look through the data, there might be a bit more. So I think it was an important issue that she is. No, she's sorry. She's not.
This is just a short answer. All the HR managers were male. Just so happened. Well, not that just so happened. It's not a coincidence. It's the fact. So we don't have anything of female HRs.
But our study is focusing on institutional cultures as well. So it may be that women might share this institutional culture, and they have to be successful in the bank. Likely, all the bank workers share the institutional culture, and we may not necessarily find that women managers are more sympathetic. Then again, they may be because they have children of their own and are suffering through the system. But I think one of the strengths of our study was what it was showing about how institutional cultures are created for both male and female bank workers. Now become
and to add the subtle ways, you know, there are overt ways, but also the subtle ways in which those cultures are created and reinforced.
All right. This last question about people working and how money does give you recognition, so you have some motivation. I just wanted to add to that it's not just money; it's also social status. There are women, because we're particularly interested, there were women who talked about how important it was to them, even agency workers, that they go to work and they wear a suit. And you know, they present themselves in a certain way, and they're working in this air-conditioned banking hall. So that's important. A lot of people, and I'm doing another study with young people, with students in the University of Ghana, and there's this perception of bank work as being desirable precisely because they don't know the background story and how much or how little people earn and so on. But there's this assumption that you are making big money. But then you also look good, you're wearing a suit, you have this quote-unquote professional appearance, you're working in this really nice, clean, white space. And that's important for people. whether all of that is enough, I don't know. I remember talking to this woman who had been working in the bank for maybe 15 or 20 years, I can't remember the exact figure, and was a manager herself, and she was adamant that she would advise her younger female colleagues not to work in a bank because it just wasn't worth it. And yet there she still was herself. I mean, it may have been that was the career she had chosen and she couldn't exit. But she was also intent on advancing and so on. But she was clear that other people, women, especially the ones that get married and have kids, not necessarily together or in that order, shouldn't take the path that she had taken. So whether or not it's worth it all in the end is, I think, it's probably an individual choice and question after all.
Small anecdote. One of the women that we interviewed in Mercy, who was sort of middle level, we interviewed her in her home and in her bedroom, and she had the largest collection of shoes I have ever seen in my entire life. And her little son had a little shoe shelf with a growing collection of shoes. And this is to say about the image, that it's important, because I did ask her about the shoes, and she said it was important that she not go to work every day. I mean, they were not all work shoes, of course, they were very colorful. But it was important that she had a certain presence going to work, and that shoes, from head to toe, including her shoes.
Any more questions?
I have an anecdote from 2 weeks ago. My name is Dr. Obadele Kamba. 2 weeks ago, I had the experience of buying a car. So I was at DVLA the whole day. So I called to my bank, this small branch car bank at Legon, and asked could they stay open later. Then the manager there is a woman. At that time, she said yes. And the guy who sold me the car, I needed to do a transfer. Because of her beauty, she was able to convince him to open an account there rather than transferring. I was wondering to what degree did you interrogate aesthetics? She was very young, very beautiful, so she was the one who was out front. If it was a man there, because he was adamant that he did not want to create an account. He told her he didn't want to create an account, but he left there with an account. And convinced that the direct transfer from Cal Bank to Cal Bank accounts would be much better. So I was wondering, did you deal with the aesthetics, the youth, and also the dynamics, because it's a small branch, so I had a relationship with the branch where I could even call the person. Did the size of the branch come in? I apologize if this was answered during the course, but I was doing coordinating activities. So.
I'm curious too, my question is directed to Akua. I think she mentioned earlier something about the women not encouraging other women to get into banking. I'm curious to, and this ties in with just the institutional culture within banking, whether these women are doing anything, little or big, in terms of changing some of the way that things are running, as regards work-life balance, or are they just sort of assimilating to the way things are done? Because it's clear that they've got issues, but are they doing anything to change that? And also, I'm curious to know about the men as well, because I mean, they also have families. Have you heard from them whether they get complaints at home about not being around, or is it sort of acceptable that they'll be at work till 9 a.m. or however long they stay there? Because very often we think that it's only the women who are burdened, but also men also have, issues. Yeah.
And a former bank worker, and my question is about promotion. And whether people are promoted through the ranks because of their merit, or whether the old boys network brings people in from outside, men who get promoted over women who have been proving themselves through the system, whether women are asked to train newcomers who then get to jump ahead of them, and whether women are expected to provide sexual favors or flirt or whatever in order to get promoted.
I'm Professor David Hookman from Calvin College, and I had a couple of specific questions that you may or may not be able to answer based on the data you gathered about mobility. I was struck by the figure that 70%, I think, of bank workers have tertiary education, 15% have secondary. And I'm wondering whether that is still a career open to secondary graduates, or whether today a tertiary degree is a necessity. And the other question is whether this serves as a step in a career. My impression in the United States is that bank work is not a very effective stepping stone to other careers in business or finance. That once you enter banking, it's quite specialized and you can advance in banking, but it's rather difficult to move into other fields. And I wondered whether some of the transfers in mobility is women working in banks who then gain the skills to move into business, finance, other fields, or whether those who leave banking generally leave the formal workforce.
Whether paper established, and also you did mention about the fact that other colleagues had researched on the phenomenon of domestic workers, because if I am writing on the male domestic worker, I think if I should get literature on the idea of the phenomenon of having women leaving in the home and going to work, and therefore other people have to take up their responsibilities at home. I mean, quote unquote responsibilities at home, and also the whole industry or sector of domestic work. If I could the literature to tie in why the need for domestic workers, and even the whole phenomenon of male domestic workers, and the idea of having mobile domestic workers because you're working in multiple homes, because all these women are away and they work from one house to the other. If I could, I just want to know if your paper is published and then the answers on domestic work is also published, because it's going to be very helpful for me as a student writing on domestic work in general.
All right, thank you, Gloria.
Thank you.
I just want to know whether you did ask the men under very informal conditions what they think, because the men can be quite cruel. The men I've been with, my age group, they call it gender women, menopausal women. They have all sorts of prejudices, and I want to know whether, and if you haven't done it, look for the men. When they are drinking their beer or when they are off their guard, and you see what they think.
Thank you.
Very bad.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'll take it over for your last minute, because you have 3 minutes.
Definitely about the aesthetics, very important. We had a slide about the image of the ideal bank worker, and we cut it up because we didn't want to take too much time. But young, definitely. When we say professional, I'm sure a lot of Ghanaians know that professional is a code for what? In Western suits and so on. Probably not locks, perms, pull back. And definitely, banks are deploying young, female, professional-looking employees into the banking hall, into customer relations. So obviously, yes, it's not a coincidence and it's not accidental. It's very strategic. Hence the shoes. As she said. As for the question about women not wanting to encourage other women. This was one particular woman, by the way, but generally, yes, there's a sense that this is really default for women. So even if I'm not discouraging you, I'm going to probably advise you to think twice about whether or not you want to do this if you have other, social ambitions. What are they doing about changing this work culture? I don't get the sense from those that I interviewed and from the transcripts that we've read that there is any concerted, conscious effort to change it. My sense, and Akosua, you can tell me whether you have the same, is that people are sort of overwhelmed by this corporate environment. This is how things are. This is where things are moving. You want the job. Other people clearly want to compete for the job, so you either shape up or ship out. I don't get the sense that there is this. Even the unions seem a little helpless in some ways. And this relates to another question about what do men think and how are men responding. The quotes that we had about how banks don't recognize social arrangements actually came from male HRs and male union leaders, so they are clearly aware that this is something that constrains them also in their roles as fathers and brothers and sons and so on and so forth. So this is pressure that they feel. They don't have the added pressure that women have because as we've all said, women are more responsible for care work. And they do seem to be aware, the union leaders especially were conscious that their female colleagues had it worse than they did. So there was some amount of sympathy, but if you're a manager and you're trying to get work done, the sympathy sort of dissolves in the face of the requirements that you have to meet targets and work your workers towards that. And then mobility and education. Part of the image of the ideal worker is definitely better educated. So young professional, etc., and better educated. And so bank HR said they were trying to get in more people who were, tertiary educated, because that was important for, as we mentioned, the broader range of skills that you are required to have in technology and other things. They felt that at least a university degree was required. In terms of whether or not this bank work is a stepping stone to other things, I didn't get the sense that people felt that it could take them anywhere, but I'm not sure I also know whether or not they felt it was more, I shouldn't say terminal, that sounds fatal. I mean, whether they thought this was where they were going to stay. I'm going to leave that and maybe also.
Okay, in terms of Gloria, can you send her an email that she can message, she can contact Dr. Akosua or myself. What will I have? There was a question about promotions and performance.
Yes.
What I remember is a complaint or sort of a romanticizing, or not romanticizing, a harking back to the past when there was an almost automatic 4-year promotion. And now, because of the performance, there are all these evaluations that have to be done, and there's objective criteria that must be used to measure. So you are not necessarily guaranteed your promotion. And hence the need to appear to be so hardworking, putting extra pressure on women in particular to keep these long hours, and not to appear to be too family-oriented. I'm rushing home to take care of the dinner and so forth. I don't know that we can say anything beyond that about the promotion.
So in one sense, I guess then that it's become a bit more objective, because you have these now performance indicators and evaluations and so on. But obviously, this is a human institution, so people still complain about how subjective it was. That the union leaders, for instance, that they didn't really keep a good paper trail. So if you had a complaint, perhaps that you're being passed over for whatever reason, you couldn't really address it properly. So on the one hand, yes, a bit more objectivity, but definitely there are still prejudices and biases that will work against women in particular.
One other, the career step, I think we can just say from personal experience that I don't know that it is or it isn't. I know people who have moved on to bigger and better, and others who have moved laterally within the banking sector. In the male opinion, I suppose that men were generally sympathetic to the challenges of working long hours and the burden that it puts on women. What I don't think was reflected was a sense that, okay, therefore we need to step in a bit more. And we don't have a sense, I don't think that we have a sense of what spouses or women working in the bank feel, what male spouses feel. So we can't speak to that.
We've run out of time, but I think we've had a really good seminar, and you've been saved from a tedious summary. So please, let's give a round of applause.
All right, we would like to thank all of you for coming out. If you can give them one more big round of applause. And also, as always, give yourselves a big round of applause. We have a huge crowd, big turnout. Once again, we had a huge crowd on Skype as well, even participants, so we'd like to thank them as well. Next week as well, we have a presentation The name of the presentation escapes me, so therefore I'll send it out by email. But it will be here, same place, same time, Thursday at 9 a.m. Don't miss it. All right, thank you.